Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Santos. I'm a staff attorney at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. And I just want to say thank you for joining us in today's webinar entitled Addressing the Legal Needs of Displaced Students Post-Harvey. I'm joined by my colleague, Patricia Julianell from Schoolhouse Connection, and we have special guests from Texas today joining us. So we have Gabriella McDonald from Texas Appleseed. We have Kristen Gendron from Texas Network of Youth Services. And finally, we have Jean Stamp from Texas Homeless Education Office. So a couple of housekeeping rules before we go further with our webinar for today. This webinar will be recorded. If you have any questions, please feel free to type that on your on the text box located on your GoToWebinar icon. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in, and we'll try to address it at the very end of the webinar. Now, before I turn it over to our wonderful speakers for today, I just want to go over some of the goals and get everyone on the same page. So today, we're going to talk about highlights of what had happened in Texas after Harvey. So you'll be hearing from Texas Network of Youth Services and Texas Appleseed, and to some extent, Texas Homeless Education Office talk about what is happening on the ground post-Harvey. We're also going to spend a lot of our time today talking about federal laws that apply and protect the education rights of displaced students. And so that's something that my colleague from Schoolhouse Connection, Patricia Julianell, will cover in today's discussion. We're also going to discuss policy recommendations and best practices with the hopes of streamlining coordination and collaboration efforts. I know there's a lot of ongoing efforts to address the multiple needs of individuals and families displaced by Harvey. One of the goals of today's webinar is to connect legal advocates with families and those stakeholders working with them. And that includes school personnel interacting with students in school setting. We also have a few legal advocates in this webinar, so I want to flag some of the legal issues for advocates. There's questions about what to ask for screening, what are the collateral legal issues, what are the importance of legal advocates, and how pro bono attorneys can help moving forward. And then finally, we'll have a list of important resources. And Texas Homeless Education Office will go over some of the Texas-specific statutes and resources available for those seeking to help families displaced by Harvey. And I do want to note that there has been ongoing disasters in other parts of the country, thinking about Irma and the wildfires happening west of the Mississippi. So a lot of the things and subjects that we're going to be talking about today apply to those issues as well. So if you have colleagues or if you know of advocates who are interested in helping out in those areas, please feel free to forward this webinar once it is made available. We also will be doing more webinars as we assess the specific needs in those areas, so please stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Audrey Coons. I'm an intern with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. And before we start the main content of the webinar, we just want to get a sense of how much everyone knows about Title VII of the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So I'm about to launch the poll. Please answer this question based on your level of familiarity on a scale of not familiar, somewhat familiar, or very familiar. This will help us gauge the effectiveness of our webinars, so we really appreciate your feedback. Okay, looks like a lot of people are voting. We're going to give about 15 more seconds for everyone to answer. Okay, looks like most people voted. Okay, so it looks like 33% of people here are very familiar, 38% are somewhat familiar, and 29% are not familiar. Thank you, everyone, for answering our poll.
So it sounds like we have a mixed bag of individuals who are familiar and somewhat familiar with McKinney-Vento. So hopefully this will solidify your knowledge of the laws protecting displaced students in times of natural disasters. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Gabriella McDonald from Texas Appleseed, to give you guys a flavor of what's happening on the ground. And again, I just want to, I want to emphasize that we're going to have the Texas folks speak first to give us structure and to use as a foundation for our conversation for the rest of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gabriella.
Thank you, Michael, very much. I just wanted to point out a couple of things that we are seeing and that we expect to see based off of our work on previous disasters. Just to let people know who don't know who Texas Appleseed is, we're based in Austin, but we work statewide throughout the state of Texas. And we work to promote social and economic justice for all Texans by leveraging the skills and resources of volunteer lawyers and other professionals to identify practical solutions to difficult systemic problems. Michael, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. And so a lot of our project areas work on a number of has a number of overlapping areas with things like for Harvey. So for housing, we're going to be looking out for things like rent gouging and wrongful convictions, FEMA help, government spending and accountability in rebuilding. For fair financial issues, we expect to see issues with predatory products that pop up, insurance, mortgages. For school to prison pipeline issues, which is something that we think is really going to be important to educators, is understanding school discipline in relation to trauma-informed care, because a lot of kids have gone through some sort of trauma coming through a hurricane like this and what's going on in their lives. Criminal and juvenile justice issues, we've heard a little bit about people who have been in other jurisdictions being arrested on warrants, whether they're misdemeanors or felonies or otherwise, and they're just being held in that other district because the jurisdictions don't actually know what to do with people who are from, Houston and might have a warrant there and need to have their case heard there. Of course, foster care and homeless youth, there are a lot of displaced children, which is what we're here to talk about today. And so a lot of our issues overlap there, and we expect to need pro bono attorneys to really work with us on some of this stuff and advocacy as we progress. And speaking of homeless youth, Michael, if you would move to the next slide, please. We have what's put out is the Homeless Youth Handbook. It's Texas specific. There are other states that have them. I don't think Florida is out yet for anybody who's joining from Florida, but it should be coming soon. But if you'll move to the next slide, Michael, what this handbook really does is explains rights and responsibilities of youth who are displaced, because a lot of youth who are homeless or who are displaced will count as homeless in instances, especially in the education realm. And this right here is the education page that I'm showing you for rights for homeless youth under the McKinney-Vento Act. And it answers a lot of the questions that we're going to be discussing and talking about today if you have additional questions. And so it's one of the many resources, and there'll be a list of resources at the end of this presentation that you will always be able to reference, including this one. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christine to talk about T-Noise a little bit.
Thank you, Gabriella. So my name is Christine Gendron. I'm the Executive Director of Texas Network of Youth Services. We go by T-Noise for short. I'm just going to give a little bit of context, first about our organization and then about what Texans might be able to expect in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in regard to student homelessness. So T-Noise is a network of organizations that serve young people who are homeless, who are in foster care, and who are at risk. Our mission is to strengthen services. We work closely with organizations serving young people and their families in the Houston area and in other areas of Texas that were impacted by the hurricane and the flood. On our website, it's actually on our blog, but you can get there from the homepage of our website. There is a post with updates on specific programs. So if you're looking for information on how specific organizations fared, we encourage you to check that out. There are a number that were evacuated. I believe it was about 22 foster care programs. Some of them have already returned to their facilities. Others might be evacuated for quite a while. A number of youth were evacuated to the San Antonio area. As far as the providers that serve young people who are homeless and on their own, so two of the biggest programs in Houston are Covenant House and the Salvation Army Young Adult Resource Center. And they, as well as others, have been working really nonstop since the hurricane started and beforehand to ensure that those who were homeless before the storm had a safe place to go, and then also to serve those who have been displaced. And we know that Covenant House had some minor damage, but has still been up and running, and that Salvation Army has also been doing some significant disaster recovery work. But again, on our website, there's info on these programs and how you can support them. Some of them are asking for donations for repairs to their facilities. Others are asking for donations for the people that they're serving, because they're serving people who have been displaced and more people who are homeless than they typically serve. Overall, we were really excited to see that members in our network really stepped up big time. I think it was 22 foster care providers that were evacuated. That is a lot. That's a lot of kids. And it was difficult to find places in Texas for everybody to go, especially considering that all kinds of other facilities were being evacuated. And a lot of our members really stepped up, and so we appreciate that. But I want to take a few minutes to provide a little bit of context on the numbers and what this might mean in terms of homelessness. So Houston Independent School District serves, or really identifies, an average of about 7,000 homeless students per year, and this is prior to Harvey. We don't yet know how those numbers are going to change in the aftermath of the hurricane, but we have reason to believe that they will go up significantly. So the estimates that we've seen are that 35,000 to 40,000 Texas students have been impacted. There was an estimate that last week 7,000 students were still in shelters. And then the White House recently estimated that 100,000 Texas homes were destroyed. Obviously, there are probably K through 12 students in many of those 100,000 homes. So it's still unclear exactly what kind of numbers we're going to be looking at, but we know that, this isn't just something that is going to be addressed as the floodwaters go down, right? But that there's going to be some long-term impact. Let's see. So there were 160 school districts in Texas that closed, as well as some charter schools. There were 4 waivers for missed school days. For some school districts, they missed their first day of school. Others had already had their first day, and they missed days shortly afterward. A lot of the focus you've probably seen, as you guys know, has been on Houston Independent School District. It's the biggest school district in Texas. It's the 7th biggest school district in the nation. And obviously, it was significantly impacted. It was not the only school district impacted, though. We know that for HISD, they'll be offering 3 free meals to all of their students for the rest of the year, so that's exciting. Also, just on Monday, they were able to open the majority of their schools. The numbers that we're seeing, we're getting different numbers from different places, but it looks like it's about maybe 250 out of 280 schools that are up and running in HISD. The news isn't as good for all school districts. For example, Port Aransas hasn't really been able to open, so they're sending their kids to districts elsewhere. I'm just going through my notes to make sure I didn't miss anything that might be of interest. So just a little bit of background, and those of you who work in education certainly probably know this perhaps better than I do, but there were a number of considerations that leaders and stakeholders had to make when looking at when to open schools and which ones. So the first thing they had to look at was infrastructure. How can people get to school? Luckily, a lot of the roads that were closed are accessible now, but we are hearing that bus service has still been impacted in many areas, and that it might be a while before school buses are up and running again the way that they would have been had Harvey not happened. The next thing was we had to look at the damage to schools. So HISD and other school districts had a lot of schools that were damaged by flooding. But yesterday, HISD was able to open more schools than I think many people expected. And they're anticipating that they'll be able to open more between now and September 25th. The other thing that they had to look at, though, was teachers. Obviously, many teachers were impacted by the hurricane and may have lost their homes or evacuated. And so schools had to look at whether they would have teachers to actually staff the schools that they reopened. And the reports that we've seen are that yesterday there were 270 teachers that didn't make it. But considering the size of HISD, that number is actually pretty low. And so, again, it seems like things are going better than planned. You know, obviously this is going to impact all school districts, not just school districts in areas that were flooded, because due to the number of families that have evacuated to other Texas cities and that might be sending their children to schools in other cities, it's really important that those who weren't in the areas directly impacted are aware of the topics that will be discussed on the webinar today. So with that, I think we'll pass it off to our next panelists who have more information than I do on McKinney-Vento and some of the technical information that you guys are probably interested to hear about. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. So before I actually pass it over to Patricia Giulianelle from Schoolhouse Connection, I just want to highlight a few resources that have been developed in response to Harvey and some of the problems that Christine had flagged for the group. So the Law Center, in collaboration with Texas Appleseed and Texas Network of Youth Services, have produced this one-pager Know Your Rights for serving Texas pre-K through 12 students displaced by Hurricane Harvey. So it pretty much talks about what the law is, who's eligible, what their rights are, and who to call for help, and the list of resources that are available for all these families. It's available online, and we'll actually have a good list of resources at the very end of the webinar, so please stay tuned. So this is one of the resources available. The other two resources that are also available online are the Law Center's Homeless Education Advocacy Manual. Now, I do want to put a caveat that this manual was updated in 2013, and so that was before Every Student Succeeds Act. However, a lot of the material in this resource is still relevant to today. So we're still in the process of updating it, hoping to get that out in a couple of weeks. And so as soon as that's out, we will share it and distribute it widely. The other resource that I hope my colleague Patricia could cover or at least address is the Schoolhouse Connection's 5 key policies for schools and supporting children and youth displaced by disasters. So a lot of the materials in these two resources will actually be folded into the substantive discussion that Patricia and I will cover in the next few slides. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Patricia.
Thanks, Michael, and hello, everyone. I'm going to provide an overview of some of the McKinney-Vento Act provisions in Title I that come into particular play when we're talking about disaster response and recovery. And then I will turn that over to Jean Stamp to talk more specifically about Texas. So I'll try to be quick so that we can get to the specific information about Texas that I know Jean's going to want to offer. So I just want to provide, like I said, an overview of some McKinney-Vento provisions, starting, of course, with the definition of who is eligible. Just kind of quickly skimming over the attendees. I know many of you are not from Texas. You may be experiencing other disasters, such as the fires that Michael mentioned that I know are very serious out west. But probably many of you are receiving evacuees in your states all over the country, whether you're actually experiencing a disaster or not. So I'm sure all of the folks on the call in one way or another will be encountering children and youth who meet the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless because they've lost their housing due to a natural disaster. So any children and youth who've lost their housing due to a disaster and are staying in an eligible situation, they will be eligible for the protections of the McKinney-Vento Act, and that's going to be the vast majority of the children and youth affected. You know, looking at Hurricane Irma hitting an area that I'm personally more familiar with, I know that there are some people who live there, and the homes that were devastated there are their second, or in some cases even their third or fourth homes. Those folks are living somewhere else in a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and so they wouldn't be covered by the McKinney-Vento Act. But the vast majority of children, youth, and families who've been uprooted by this disaster are going to be covered by the McKinney-Vento Act. So as you look through this slide, slide and the next one, and you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. They're just covering the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness that, if you're familiar with the law, you've seen many, many times before. And so any children and youth living in any of those eligible situations, even if it goes on for a very long time, when you look at the extent of the flooding that we've seen in Texas, unfortunately, there are going to be a number of children and youth who probably will be eligible under McKinney-Vento for a very extended period of time as their families try to get back on their feet, particularly those families who were struggling with poverty and homelessness even before the disasters hit. As Christine said, shelters themselves were evacuated. So you have families who were homeless before and are now continue to be homeless, but just in a different setting. I would point out the substandard housing piece on this slide. Particularly after a disaster, sometimes people can sort of stay in their homes, but there can be a lot of water damage. There can be damage to utilities that lasts for a long time. There can be mold damage that makes it unsafe for people to be in their home. So just because the home looks okay on the outside, that does not mean that that home is actually habitable or actually qualifies as a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So again, unfortunately, you see images of destruction with the homes completely destroyed. Obviously, those students are going to be McKinney-Vento, but there's a lot of homes that look okay when you just look outside the front door, but there could be a lot of damage inside that makes that house substandard, infestations, mold, utilities, etc. And again, those children and youth who are staying elsewhere in a homeless situation because of that will qualify under the McKinney-Vento Act. Next slide. Unaccompanied youth, again, any youth who's living in a homeless situation, if they're not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, they meet that definition of unaccompanied youth. And the McKinney-Vento Act, of course, will apply to them. We know sometimes in disasters, especially when there's significant flooding, like in Harvey, families get separated. And so youth might be living one place and parents and younger children might be living someplace else. All of those unaccompanied youth are going to be covered by the McKinney-Vento Act. One piece that I actually just remembered and forgot to put on the slide, and I'll put the link later up in the chat box so people can see it, but in 2010, the Department of Ed came out with some guidance on FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and did specify that unaccompanied youth can access their own educational record. They can consent for disclosure for those records, and they can access it. It's a can, it's not a must. But particularly for schools that are enrolling youth who are unaccompanied and trying to serve youth who are unaccompanied, those young people might want to share educational information with their attorneys or with FEMA or with other advocates or agencies. And schools can permit youth to just go ahead and consent for that disclosure on their own. So I'll put that link up to that FERPA guidance so that people can see it. But I just want to make sure that school folks in particular, as well as advocates and attorneys, are aware that that guidance is out there. Next slide. In terms of kind of the response team at local educational agencies, and in case anyone's not familiar with the term LEA, that includes school districts, but it also includes public charter schools. And I know a number of charter schools in Texas were affected. So all your charter schools, as well as your school districts, should have a liaison who's designated to implement the McKinney-Vento Act in that area. I know Jean can talk about this more later, but they've got a great resource on their website where you can actually find your liaison contact information for your district right up on their website. So if you're advocating for students, or if you yourself are a family or student in that district and you want to find out, who can help me with all this McKinney-Vento stuff, that's the person. It's going to be your liaison. Liaisons are required by federal law to be able to carry out their duties, which essentially means that they have the time and capacity they need to do that. Certainly responding to a very significant disaster like Hurricane Harvey probably is going to take up more time than what the liaisons probably typically expect or budget in their work plans. And so a number of these school districts, as they're looking at not only the emergency response, but the long-term recovery, probably need to look at their liaison capacity and think about how can we increase the capacity of that position because they're having to respond to a lot more children and youth experiencing homelessness than we originally had estimated. Next slide. Liaisons, as I said, have a number of specific duties that are spelled out in the law, and I'm not going to go over all of those duties right now. Folks can take a look at the law and at some of the legal resources that are available. But just to point out a few things in particular in responding to disasters, identification is important. You know, there's a new influx of children and youth experiencing homelessness now, not only in Texas, but all over the country as evacuees and displaced students are finding themselves in all corners of the US. And so making sure that we're reaching out and identifying those students as they come into our areas so that they can receive appropriate supports is really important. I'll go over some of the rest of this later, but referrals, of course, to health, dental, mental health, and housing programs. In a lot of communities, the school really is the center of all disaster response and recovery. That's where people are going with questions. That's where people stayed in shelters when the hurricane hit. And that's where people know they can go to get referrals and information. So making sure that, that school districts have available information about things like how do you apply for FEMA benefits and who are the disaster recovery agencies in our local area, and that you can provide that information to families and to youth who need it. Training for school personnel, I want to mention also, you know, a lot of teachers are going to have displaced students in their classrooms, and they'll probably know that those students are displaced, but they might not even know what the McKinney-Vento Act is, and they might not know that those children are eligible for certain assistance and rights under McKinney-Vento. So as your district is putting out information about disasters to teachers, to counselors, to nurses, to other areas of the school community and the community at large, try to make sure there's a line in there at least about McKinney-Vento, the liaison's contact information, make sure people know that there are rights and services in place for those students as it relates to school. Next slide. Identification, like I said, it's really important to make sure that students who are displaced by disasters realize what their rights are. We always say when you're doing identification and sharing McKinney-Vento information, we always say don't use the word homeless. It's not really a helpful word. It conjures up a lot of stereotypes. That certainly is true after a disaster as well. You know, most of the disaster recovery agencies are using words like displaced or evacuees or different terms. It really doesn't matter what label you put on it. It's the best thing to do is describe the situation. Did you lose your housing? Are you staying somewhere temporarily because you lost your housing? That will get people's attention, make them pay attention to the information, and hopefully get that, that helpful information into their hands. Next slide. I talked about training already, so I won't belabor that. But putting information out in the communities, of course, this is a requirement under the McKinney-Vento Act to disseminate information about the law and about what children's rights are, and to put that information out into places frequented by eligible families in a manner and form that's understandable to those families. You know, when we're responding to a disaster, that really broadens the kinds of places where we should put that notice. So we always want to be putting notices in motels, for example, and that's certainly true after a disaster. But after a disaster, collaborating with your relief agencies that are in your community, whether it's the Red Cross or Salvation Army or other volunteer organizations, to make sure they have your brochure, your flyer, or certainly your liaison contact information, so that those agencies are getting that information out. Using housing questionnaires upon enrollment, that will help you identify anyone who's living in a homeless situation, whether that's because of a disaster or because of economic reasons or other reasons. So those questionnaires are really important. And making sure that we're asking about preschool age siblings too, since a lot of our school age children will be identified at the school building, but their younger siblings who are too young to come to school might not be, but there are other early childhood programs that they could access if they had information about them. So I'll get into that a little bit more later, but just wanted to say don't forget about the under 6 and under 5-year-old children. Next slide. So now I'm going to quickly go over basically 3 topics in the McKinney-Vento Act: removing barriers, school of origin, and immediate enrollment. And I'll go through those pretty quickly so we can get to Jean and some of the Texas-specific information she can share about that. So just generally on removing barriers, of course, there is a general requirement in the McKinney-Vento Act at both the state and local level to revise policies to remove barriers to the identification, enrollment, and retention of McKinney-Vento students. And I just wanted to put that requirement up there because as schools are responding to natural disasters, as schools are receiving children from areas that are responding to natural disasters, some of these barriers that maybe have gone unnoticed are likely to perhaps be noticed for the first time. And it's a really important opportunity to advocate for reviewing policies and revising policies to eliminate barriers. Things that are barriers to enrollment and retention and identification for children and youth who've been displaced by disasters are very likely to be barriers for children and youth experiencing homelessness for any reason. And so as those come up in the disaster response moment that we're in now, it's a good idea to go ahead and take this opportunity to review those and to make changes that are going to facilitate a school district's response to all homelessness in the future. And so from an advocacy perspective, it's kind of an opportunity to do some of that advocacy now that can remain in place in the future and help all of our McKinney-Vento students, regardless of the reason for their homelessness. Next slide. The next topic I want to cover is School of Origin. School of Origin basically provides educational stability for students as homelessness might force them to move around from district to district or place to place. The definition of school of origin is on this slide. It's the school attended when this child was permanently housed or the school in which last enrolled, and that does include preschool programs. So we can provide that school stability to young children as well as K through 12 children. And you can see on the slide that McKinney-Vento students have the right to remain in the school of origin for as long as they're homeless, and then also to complete the academic year in which they find permanent housing in that school of origin. Now, when you're talking about entire school districts that are flooded, school districts in Texas that are closed indefinitely, obviously some children are not going to be able to remain in their school of origin because their school of origin simply isn't open, or because they have left and gone to stay with someone, with relatives or someone else in another state, hundreds or thousands of miles away. So sometimes school of origin really just doesn't come into play for certain victims of natural disasters, but for others it does. They are able to go to their school of origin. Next slide. And that determination is really going to be made based on their best interest. So we always presume that school stability is best for students. We know it actually is best for student achievement. It's better for the school to have that stability as well. So we're going to try to keep students stable in their school of origin as long as that is in their best interest. And so you can see on the slide, I won't belabor this point, but the different best interest factors that come into play. And of course, there is a requirement to give priority to the request of the parent or guardian, or in the case of an unaccompanied youth, to give priority to the request of that young person. Next slide. When students are staying in their school of origin, transportation is required. So LEAs, again, that's school districts and charter schools, are required to provide transportation to and from the school of origin. You know, Christine mentioned how some bus routes aren't up and running yet. And when you're talking about a natural disaster where infrastructure is damaged or in some cases destroyed, the timing for some of this can vary and maybe not be as quick as it would be in another situation where there weren't this kind of really severe infrastructure damage or destruction. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, that transportation to and from the school of origin is required, even if it's not typically provided under other circumstances. So McKinney-Vento students can get to and from school so they can have that school stability. Next slide. Other transportation, you know, transportation to extracurricular activities, transportation that is provided to other students, whether that be to a preschool program or to other school programs, that is also required for our McKinney-Vento students. Next slide. Immediate enrollment, this one is always important under McKinney-Vento and becomes an issue in natural disasters as well. when McKinney-Vento students are enrolling in a new school because, again, their school of origin maybe is just closed and not reopening, or they're not going to the school of origin due to distance or due to it not being in their best interest, they are entitled to immediate enrollment in the public school that's close to where they're staying, or any public school that students living in the same attendance area would be eligible to attend. So for example, there might be charter schools serving that particular area, regular public schools, etc. That enrollment is immediate, even when students don't have documents that are typically required. And for students who are evacuated from floods, fires, hurricanes, other emergencies, they typically do not have those documents. And sometimes they can be delayed in coming in from other schools as well. Again, if you've got a school district that's just completely closed, you've got school districts that are out of power, they don't have electricity, so they can't get into an office, turn on a light, they can't email you a folder. So some of those documents are going to be significantly delayed and are not going to get to the new school. Nonetheless, enrollment must be immediate, and the new school basically just does the best they can to enroll as accurately as possible based on the information they can get from the parent, from the student, and from the previous school if that's possible. Next slide. I remember after Hurricane Katrina, when you literally had complete destruction of school records, there was no way those school records were ever going to get sent. They were in the Gulf of Mexico. And at that time, Houston was receiving the evacuees. And I remember the McKinney-Vento liaison at the time telling me that they enrolled thousands of students in a matter of days with not a single shred of paper on any of them. And at the end of the day, when they were able to start getting some documents in, the adjustments that they had to make to student schedules were very, very minimal. She said the biggest issue were some students who were on IEPs and they didn't even really know it. And so they weren't able to convey the different services that they were supposed to be getting. But even then, the adjustments, when you consider the extent of the problem and the number of students enrolled, were really minimal. And so I would suspect we'll see something similar now that Houston is the victim of this disaster and the students are going elsewhere. Enrollment does include attending classes and participating fully in school activities. So again, we want to get children in school and fully participating as quickly as the infrastructure allows. That kind of full participation, not only is it the law, but it also really helps with some of the trauma and mental health effects that kids are sure to be feeling as they're dealing with loss and instability, that maybe that particular sports team or that particular activity really can bring them some comfort as they're trying to deal with the trauma of losing their home and in some cases, tragically, even losing family members. Next slide. Just quickly on preschool, I basically just put this in here as a placeholder just to remind people that, of course, there are a lot of infants and toddlers who have been victims of these natural disasters. So to the extent that you've got public preschool available in your community, Head Start, child care subsidies, all of those programs do have special requirements to provide priority to children and families, experiencing homelessness, and that's the same whether their homelessness is due to a natural disaster or due to some other factor. So if you're advocating for families with young children, you can try to reach out to those early childhood programs. This isn't just about K-12 education, it's about early childhood as well. Next slide. So yeah, like I said, there's the Head Start, Early Head Start, and just a link on our website for more specific information about those legal requirements. I'm not going to go over them now, but there are requirements under those programs to prioritize and do outreach and immediate enrollment for young children experiencing homelessness. Next slide. I am getting ready to wrap up here. Again, full participation. I spoke about this already. There is even more emphasis now in McKinney-Vento post Every Student Succeeds Act to make sure that students can participate immediately, not only in academic activities, but also in extracurricular activities. So again, those sports teams, the clubs, etc., making sure that students who are coming into new schools because of being evacuated or displaced, that they can fully participate. Next slide. And last thing I want to talk about here is Title I. Now that the Every Student Succeeds Act amendments to Title I are fully in place with this new school year, all local educational agencies that receive Title I-A funds must set aside funds to serve McKinney-Vento students. So that's true even if a school district is completely school-wide Title I, meaning every school is already getting Title I money, they still need to set aside funds to serve students experiencing homelessness. And after a disaster, when homelessness is spiking in areas a lot higher than what they might have anticipated, it's a good time to revisit that set aside. Find out, if you don't know how much it is in your particular community or school district, find out. Is there a set aside? How much is it? And is there good reason to increase that set aside to assist the district in responding to the disaster and to the increase in homelessness, particularly as a result of that disaster? I can tell you that at Schoolhouse Connection, we are advocating with Congress to appropriate additional funds for disaster relief, particularly for McKinney-Vento programs in school districts. You saw last week the first two hurricane relief bills were passed. There's going to be a number of bills. We will be in one of them. And we're working closely with the Texas Homeless Education Office, and of course, we'll be in touch with Florida as well to find out how much money we should fight for and how we can justify that and how we can get it out very quickly and very flexibly to schools to help them help their students and their families. Next slide. Yeah, so this I think is my last slide if I'm remembering correctly. I just wanted to kind of put the law up there on the slide for people, for advocates to take a look at. Those Title I funds can be used for a lot of things that Title I funds are not typically used for. So I talked earlier about liaison capacity. Title I funds can go to increase the hours that the liaison is spending, or to bring somebody on part-time or temporary to help respond to the immediate needs after this disaster. They can also be used to help with transportation. They can be used to help connect young children with pre-K, and also to provide some of that mental health support that I mentioned. We know that the mental health effects of disasters last long after the immediate physical effects might be over. And particularly when you're talking about a place like Houston, where a lot of these families actually were still there from Katrina. So they remember being evacuated from Katrina, and now they're being evacuated again and being re-traumatized, and some of the effects that that can have on parents, children, and professionals as well. A lot of people working in the school districts and in other parts of Houston are there from Katrina and now are having to experience this trauma and this horrible disaster all over again. So using some of those Title I funds to address some of those mental health needs could be a really great decision and a really great assistance to children and to families. If I remember correctly, I think that's my last slide. And so I'm very happy to pass it over to Jean.
Actually, before we pass it on to Jean.
Oh, sorry, Michael, I forgot.
No worries, no worries.
My bad.
Yeah, so I'm going to breeze through my slides and then pass it over to Jean, because I know Jean is a hot commodity for today's webinar. Anyway, so Patricia talked about the law of McKinney-Vento and some of the nuances within McKinney-Vento. You know, at the Law Center, we see McKinney-Vento as an access to justice issue. And what I mean by that is that a lot of students and families who are experiencing homelessness or who have been displaced because of a natural disaster do not have the access or luxury of or privilege of accessing legal counsel or legal resources. And so the next few slides is really dedicated to answering the following questions, right? What role can lawyers play, and how can lawyers or legal advocates get involved in light of what Patricia just talked about? So one thing that I wanted to cover in this webinar is the dispute resolution. And so what the dispute resolution really is that the state and school districts within that state are required to have a dispute resolution process in place if there is a dispute arising over eligibility, McKinney-Vento eligibility, school selection, or school enrollment. And I do want to note that you'll see in the slide that there are references to the US Code. In Patricia's previous slides, there were references to the guidance, and what the guidance means is it's the McKinney-Vento guidance that was issued by the U.S. Department of Education in July of 2016 and recently amended in March of 2017. So that's available online, but if you're having trouble finding that, I'm happy to provide the link to anyone who is looking for the guidance. So moving on, the dispute resolution requirement requires school districts to provide notice of the decision, of the school district's decision, and the right to appeal. Now, we're not saying that there's going to be a lot of disputes arising because of the disaster. However, given the lack of knowledge of families and also the lack of knowledge of some school districts and some school personnel who haven't been trained to understand what McKinney-Vento is, we are anticipating some disputes happening. And so this is just a precaution, and we want to make sure that this is covered. And I'll be listing a couple of reasons as to why it's a good idea to actually connect these families with attorneys and legal advocates on the ground. So another requirement under the dispute resolution is dependency requirement, and that is the immediate enrollment until a full and final resolution of the dispute and all available appeals. And so Patricia talked previously about immediate enrollment, and it's the same kind of idea, same sense in this under this provision. So we want to make sure that we provide educational continuity and stability to displaced students. Enroll them now, ask questions later. And finally, under McKinney-Vento, parents, guardians, and unaccompanied youth must be referred to the liaison. And so Patricia covered what the duties of the liaisons are. And so that's a good idea to get in touch with if you're already working on a McKinney-Vento dispute. Now, I just want to flag a couple of legal considerations when you're actually dealing with a dispute resolution process. So starting with impartiality, variability, and equitability. So thinking about, is the process actually fair? Is it uniform? One of the frustrations of families experiencing homelessness dealing with multiple school districts is that the dispute resolution process, at least on the school district level, is not uniform. It varies from one district to another. So you can cross from one school district to another and encounter two different grievance procedures, two different McKinney-Vento dispute resolution procedures. Thinking about accessibility and considering students who are also immigrants and also experiencing homelessness, and the requirements under the law that they must be provided with the notice of the right to appeal and the notice of the school district's decision. Another consideration to look into is the scope. If a dispute arises over eligibility, enrollment, and placement, there has to be a dispute resolution process in place. The fourth consideration is the evidentiary standard. So Patricia talked about the best interest standard, and so that's kind of what I was referring to here. But also at a more fundamental level, thinking about how one should go about proving eligibility. So we want to make sure that the process itself is very fair and transparent. There's also some privacy concerns that go about determining eligibility and safety concerns for those families who are fleeing domestic violence, for example. We do have one case in Michigan where the host family was contacted by the school district, and as a result, the landlord of the host found out that they were in violation of the lease and proceeded to evict the entire the family and the host family and the family experiencing homelessness. So those are the kinds of violations that we want to prevent from happening. We talked about the notice requirement, and we also talked about dependency requirements. So I'm just going to breeze through that. But dependency requirement again requires that the student be immediately enrolled in the school that they wish to attend until all disputes and available appeals are resolved. And again, from the legal perspective, if that is being violated, then you can file a temporary injunction as a form of relief. The other consideration I think is really, really important is what are the alternative options and other grievance procedures available for students displaced by Harvey and natural disasters and students experiencing homelessness. And the reason I bring this up is because homelessness does not exist in a vacuum. It often intersects and overlaps with other federal laws and other cultural identities. And so I just want to take a second here and talk about what are those other disproportionalities that homelessness impacts. So throughout my work, we see a lot of intersection between homelessness and children and youth with disabilities. We see a lot of intersection between homelessness and LGBTQ youth, immigrant children and English language learners, children and youth aging out of the foster care or in contact with the foster care system. We talked about children and youth displaced by natural disasters, and then also children of domestic violence survivors. And these have their own grievance procedures, thinking about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act or the Office of Civil Rights, enforcing the rights of LGBTQ youth not to be discriminated. So there are multiple grievance procedures, and for families displaced by natural disasters and those experiencing homelessness, having to deal with multiple grievance procedures can be very, very overwhelming. And so I just wanted to flag as to why it's really important that families get connected to legal advocates on the ground. And on that note, I think this is something that Gabriela McDonald from Texas Appleseed has already addressed at the very beginning of today's webinar, is that when you run into a student displaced by a natural disaster and someone who's experiencing homelessness, chances are there's a big chance that there's a constellation of legal needs that often go beyond education. And so these are some of the legal needs that we've seen at play: criminalization, domestic violence, FEMA benefits, housing and renters' rights, obtaining identification, immigration, insurance, and then privacy and safety concerns. And I do want to flag that in Houston, most recently, there's actually an ongoing lawsuit between the ACLU and the National Law Center against the city of Houston because they were criminalizing individuals experiencing homelessness prior to Harvey. And so when I talk about criminalization, thinking about criminalization in the form of quality of life ordinances, but in the context of students and children and youth, thinking about criminalization in the form of status offenses and school discipline. So these are ongoing legal needs that may need to be addressed in addition to access to education issues. And for those of you you consider yourselves as school personnel, these are just some of the role of lawyers and legal advocates can play and why it's really important for them to be connected to students and their families. They can be the primary advocates. They can do a lot of fact finding and cut the work for you guys. They can enforce McKinney-Vento and ensure compliance. And thinking about collateral consequences of homelessness and natural disasters, they can craft different legal remedies that would better suit the needs of the family or the student. And lastly, they can be good policy advocates, depending on how involved they are with someone's case. Now, for those of you who are actual legal providers, you're probably wondering, and you haven't done a lot of McKinney-Vento cases or enrollment issues, you're probably wondering, like, what kinds of questions, screening questions, or legal issues should I be flagging for? So this is a running list of some of the questions that I thought will be helpful for you to consider when you're actually thinking of revising your intake forms, right? So thinking about asking, what is your current living situation? How would you describe your current living situation? The latter question really focusing on the definition of what substandard housing is. That's something that Patricia covered in past few slides. Are they living with 10 other people in a one-bedroom house? Does that make it inadequate? And if so, they may qualify for McKinney-Vento housing supports and services. Second question is the child or youth enrolled, attending school, and participating in school activities? Again, that should trigger. If they're not, then that might be a potential legal issue under McKinney-Vento. Have they been disenrolled? And if so, do they have a copy of the decision? Have they been provided with a copy of the decision? Have they been provided with a notice of their rights under McKinney-Vento? Or have they been identified as McKinney-Vento eligible? So understanding what those reasons are for disenrolling them by the school district will be helpful. Another question to consider is, does the child or youth have trouble enrolling in school? Has enrollment been delayed? Thinking about the immediate enrollment requirement under McKinney-Vento. More importantly, is there a dispute between the child or youth and the school? And again, this is what I had covered in the past few slides about the dispute resolution requirements under McKinney-Vento. And if there are follow-up questions around that, I'm happy to answer those offline. And then finally, are there school-related services that you need? There are other, education-related services that are provided in addition to McKinney-Vento. McKinney-Vento often goes hand in hand with other funding streams and other supports and services, and so they may qualify based on they're eligible, if they're actually eligible for those programs. So that was my slide. I'm going to turn it over now to Jean Stamp from Texas Homeless Education Office.
Hold on really quickly, Michael, before we switch over to Jean Stamp. This is Gabriella again. And I just wanted to let, if there are any lawyers on the line, know who to reach out to be able to help in some of these efforts. And when you're going to be asking those questions, when you're working with people, reach out to Houston Volunteer Lawyers Program. They have a hotline available. The Texas State Bar is using and answering questions, and they need lawyers to do that. TRALA, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, and Lone Star Legal Aid. Lone Star Legal Aid, I'm sure some of you are aware their offices actually exploded during Harvey, but they are up and running individually by at least their cell phones and some of their emails, and they're also working. And then Baker Botts put on a really great webinar previously where they put out a Harvey Crisis Response Guide. That's what it's actually called, the Harvey Crisis Response Guide, and that's available online for when you're working with those organizations. So I will go ahead and now turn it over to Jean now that you have that information as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This is Jean Stamp, and I'm the director of the Texas Homeless Education Office. And next slide, please. So our office works with the Texas Education Agency and the Region 10 Education Service Center to conduct the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program in Texas. And we provide certain programmatic services, which I'll talk about in a little bit later slide. First of all, I want to thank everybody else who spoke because that's really great information. I'm glad all of you are on the line because I think it's really much needed. I do want to say also that the Texas Education Agency has a wonderful legal department, and they're also very, very helpful in getting information out to the LEAs about implementing the McKinney-Vento Act and other state laws that benefit homeless children and youth. Next slide, please. I do want to thank Patricia for her really concise and very clear overview of the McKinney-Vento Act and all of the provisions in it. I think it's really important that we all understand those and be on the same page. And I know I have gotten questions in the last couple of weeks about whether or not the provisions of the federal McKinney-Vento Act are going to be waived in this crisis situation. And I want to assure everybody they are not waived. If anything at all, we really are intensifying how we make sure we apply them to all students who are in need, all students who meet that definition of homeless that have been displaced. So no, there is no waiving of this federal law. It's there for us to really help students be able to be stable in their schools and get their education. So what does this look like in Texas? And a lot of the things I'm talking about, while I'll be talking about Texas, for those of you that are on from different states, please contact your state coordinators at your state education agencies and others that are working with McKinney-Vento in your state for specifics about how your state may be addressing or dealing with certain things. So in Texas, these, and Christine gave us some statistics when she spoke earlier, but these are some of the statistics that we have gotten recently through the Texas Education Agency. And of course, they're estimates. We don't really know the specifics of how many students, how many districts, how many employees, but just based on the information that we're getting, it looks like we could have as many as 1.5 million students impacted. That doesn't mean all the students, of course, are homeless, but impacted by the storms. 250 to 300 schools that have been impacted. Almost 200,000 employees. And these are employees that have also lost their homes, or their homes are flooded, or have family members that were affected. And they are not only having to try to work and go back to school and help others in this situation, but they're dealing with this themselves personally. And it's a very stressful situation for many of the liaisons. 106,000 to 200,000 new homeless students. That's new homeless students. Last year, we had something like 120,000 children identified through Texas public schools. So if we're looking at adding an additional 100 to 200,000, that's a tremendous amount of students for our school districts to be trying to assist and make sure those kids are stable in school and have their needs met. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I did was added some slides that really talk about some of the questions we have been getting asked in our office. So again, all the basics that Patricia described apply, and we work under that federal law because federal law supersedes any state laws, and both federal and state laws supersede any kind of school district policies. In Texas, we work with independent school districts rather than unified school districts, which may look a little different from state to state. But even so, school districts cannot create policies or procedures that would be in conflict with state or federal laws. And I think Patricia identified early on that it's a good idea to go through policies and procedures at each of our school districts to make sure that they align well with our federal McKinney-Vento laws and with our state laws that support the McKinney-Vento laws. And Texas has quite a few that do support the McKinney-Vento laws. So one of the things that we've been asked about is, are there waivers available for districts and charter schools that close or operate with low student attendance due to a disaster? And so, yes, if your school must close or you have low attendance due to that, you can apply to the commissioner for 2 specific kinds of waivers, and they're addressed on this slide. And this is also the link to take you to those waivers and help you complete those and let you know who to send those to. Next slide. So will students who have missed school be subject to truancy at some point? There should be a lot of leeway given to children who are missing some school days, either because they have been displaced, they're in a homeless situation, their schools have been closed. All of those things should be considered before looking at how to proceed with their missed days. All school-age children, of course, are subject to compulsory attendance, and in Texas, that's between the ages of 6 and 19. But when you have children who have been displaced, there has to be a reasonable time for them, their families, to decide about which school they're going to be returning to, or whether they're going to enroll in their residency zone school, before looking at proceeding any further with anything as severe as looking at truancy charges. And in Texas, we actually have a state law that requires that school districts create and work a truancy prevention program with students who are in homeless situations, also students who are in foster situations, and that school districts actually document their activities and the efforts that they have made in working those plans and trying to achieve the objectives and success of those plans before they can proceed to do anything like bring a child or a family up with truancy charges. And there's a Texas Education Code citation for that. It's really important to know that, and it will be applied, of course, during this disaster, the same as it's applied at any other time for our students who are in homeless situations. So we're really trying to look at, are these students actually missing school because of their displaced and homeless situation? And how do we put supports in place to help them with that, rather than looking at this as a disciplinary or a punishment type issue? What can we do to actually help students be able to enroll in, attend, and be successful in school? Next slide. Okay, we've also gotten asked, can Texas students enroll elsewhere if their home district is closed? If a family meets the McKinney-Vento definition of homeless, as described by Patricia earlier, whether it's due to a disaster or another reason, those children can immediately enroll elsewhere. Texas allows students who are homeless to enroll in any Texas school district, any LEA, regardless of their residency. So whether they've ever attended school in that school district or they currently attend school in that school district, those students are allowed to pick a district if they're homeless and enroll in that district. Now, we call that the Texas Third Choice. It does not come with a provision of transportation normally, and it is such that the district can choose which campus. So in that way, it's a little bit different than looking at the school of origin or the school of residency, because those generally are a particular campus that's being chosen. So a child who is not homeless, but their district is closed, according to TEA, may also choose another district to go to school in. But when their own school reopens, their own district reopens and they go back, they will be working with the district days calendar in the previous school that they were in. And so looking at transportation, before I even move to the transportation slide for these two things, these may be areas where we're looking at, is lack of transportation a barrier for students to get to another district when their school district is closed? And if so, for homeless students, that transportation might have to be provided. And I'm saying might because TEA is currently working on a transportation to the administrator letter that will come out, and they'll be addressing a lot of the specifics around transportation for closed districts. They'll also be addressing funding and how to pay for not only school of origin transportation, which will be increased because of the disaster, but other transportation where many of these students that we're talking about from this slide would need transportation to actually get to another district. Next slide. So what transportation requirements apply to homeless students? So under current state law, school districts are funded for transportation based on their prior year. So districts that transport eligible homeless students during a school year receive transportation funding for those additional transportation services that settle up, which occurs the fall following the close of the school year. And again, I can tell you that with the TAA letter that's coming out, they are going to be addressing funding for additional transportation, not only for school of origin, but other transportation as well. And unfortunately, I don't have a finalized version of that letter to talk to you about, but please watch our website, because as soon as that's released, we will have it on our website, as will the Texas Education Agency. And I have our website addresses on a later slide for you. So homeless students have a federally protected right to transportation to and from their school of origin. This is very important. So we can't have a state law that says, well, in a disaster, we're not going to do school of origin transportation, or we can't have a school district saying, well, you know, we just can't do school of origin transportation during a disaster. We really have to be able to provide that. Now, it might take a little longer to set it up when we're looking at having flooded buses and not enough bus drivers and closed districts and some things like that. And there may be some other complications where you have one district involved in the school of origin transportation that's closed while the other district is open, and might have to provide it completely until the other district can open and be up and working. So all those things would need to be worked out between the districts, but we're not alleviated of the requirement to do that. It is a federally protected right. And it is something that we want to have happen when, and I think other people have talked about this, but when children are displaced from their homes, it's really much more impactful to also be displaced from their schools. They need some sort of stability where they can be with known teachers, known friends, known surroundings. And if that can be in their school of origin, that's going to be so much more helpful for them, not only educationally, but socially, emotionally as well. So TEA working on the TAA letter, please keep watch for our website for that. As soon as we receive it, we'll also do an email blast out to all of the Texas Homeless Liaisons offices to make sure that they have that information. Next slide. If my district has additional enrollments of homeless students, can the district amend its ESSA, Consolidated Federal Grant Application, to increase its Title I homeless reservation? And the short answer for that is yes. So LEAs that receive that Title I Part A funds have to have that reservation, as was mentioned earlier, but you certainly can do an amendment to the application. What districts should do is contact their ESSA, Consolidated Application Negotiator in the Grants Administration Division, and get information about how to submit that amendment. Next slide. So another question that we've been asked a lot, and I think again it's been addressed a bit here, is what services can my district provide to homeless students using the Title I funds? So we know that all districts receiving Title I Part A funds must serve homeless students, and all students are eligible to be served through Title I funds, and regardless of what campus they're attending. So we have some school districts that all the campuses are Title I, and we have many school districts where they do have some campuses that are not Title I. Services should be provided for homeless students that are on any of those campuses. They can be traditional instructional kinds of services like tutoring and class aids, those sorts of things. But there also are a number of non-traditional Title I services that are allowable for students in homeless situations. And most of these are whether they're in a homeless situation due to a disaster or just other reasons for their homeless situation. So if funds are not reasonably available from other public or private sources, so many times it's a matter of looking at, can we get this from our community? Do we have a community service provider that will provide a particular service? And if not, then we may use our Title I Part A funds, and that can be for things like eyeglasses, clothing to meet school dress needs or uniform requirements, maybe some emergency medical, dental kinds of things, immunizations. Information for health and social service referrals, a lot of different things that would just allow a student to be able to be in a seat and focus and fully engaged in their education. So while those might not be considered traditional instructional items, they're very important in order for a student to be able to focus and learn. And just as we know that children don't function well on an empty stomach. They need food to do that. They don't function well when they don't have the school supplies, school needs, when their mental health issues are not addressed, when they aren't dressed or have the uniform or the clothing that they need. All those things are things that detract from their ability to learn and remember and feel like they belong in a school. So we want to address all of those. You cannot use Title I Part A funds for things like utilities, rent, hotel, motel rooms, expenses for parents, whether that be clothing or medical expenses, those kinds of things. If you have questions about what Title I can be used for, contact the school district's Title I director. They will know what the allowable expenditures are for Title I. When it comes to McKinney-Vento dollars, every state gets a small pot of money to be able to do statewide activities and to put out in grant funds to the LEAs or the ESCs. We do that in Texas as well. If there are any questions about what a school district has in their grant, you can contact the homeless liaison for that school district, and on our directory, on our website, you can get the name, the phone number, and the email address for every homeless liaison in the state of Texas. And you can find out what's in that grant for that district if they have that grant. And if you have suggestions, if you're a community service provider, if you're someone who works with families and children, and you're hearing these are needs in the community that are going unmet, you can make suggestions for adding something to the grant, either in the next coming year or amending the current year grant to include a need that you're seeing within your district. Next slide. Okay, so these are just a couple of links to resource pages. One is to the Texas Education Agency, and there's a list of question answers for dealing with disasters, and many of the answers on my slide actually came from this list. Also, we have on our website, the Texas Homeless Education Office website, a really robust disaster response page. We have a lot of links to many different resources, federal, state, as well as some local resources. And we have lots of information on kind of how to proceed, how to address these issues in the community, how to talk with families and children about disaster, what to do to help children feel safe and secure in their schools, to try and minimize as much of the trauma as possible for our students that are going through a disaster of this type. Next slide. Okay, so this is our office and this is what we do. And again, we work with Region 10 Education Service Center and the Texas Education Agency. So we help get out the word about guidance for Texas schools, both the LEAs as well as the Education Service Centers, making sure that they understand what needs to be done to be in compliance, to remove barriers, to provide the supports and services that are needed. We do that a lot of different ways. We do a lot of training in the districts and in the community, at the schools, at the education service centers. And I would invite you to contact me if you would like to have a training in your community, with your school district, with your education service center. We'll be happy to come out and provide that training. We do technical assistance in person, on the phone, we have, or email. We have a complaints hotline, a 1-800 line there at the bottom of the page. We get a lot of calls from parents, from students that maybe are having difficulties enrolling in a particular school or getting services that they need. And we're happy to help intervene and advocate for those students and make sure that school districts are complying with the law and understand what they need to do to be able to help those students stay stable. We also help with dispute resolution assistance. So we always like to work with school districts and families and students to work out conflicts or issues before it gets to the point where someone feels like they need to file a formal dispute process. Many of the issues that we see that come through are just matters of people, particular people on a campus may not understand what the provisions of McKinney-Vento require or state laws require. Maybe there's someone filling in for a registrar today that doesn't really understand what they're supposed to do when they have a student enrolling who's homeless. Many times when we have families or students call in, they've never spoken to the LEA's homeless liaison. That position that needs to know about that student doesn't really even know that they're there trying to enroll or in a homeless situation. And 9 times out of 10, it's really just connecting them to that homeless liaison, and the homeless liaison will work out whatever the issues are that are going on. So a lot of disputes can sort of be headed off at the pass, so to speak. That will be Texas lingo. For not having a formal dispute has to be filed. However, if it must, everything Michael said applies to that. We have the dispute resolution process that was worked out through the Texas Association of School Boards and the Texas Education Agency and our office. On our website, it takes the family, the student, the school, step by step through the process and what they need to do, what each side needs to do, what the time frames are, and what that process needs to look like. And with the really important piece, like Michael said, is that the students are enrolled and attending school throughout the whole dispute process, and that's a very important piece of it. Our office does, luckily, and from our point of view, we're happily asked occasionally to give some input on a federal and state level. And we really appreciate those opportunities when we can talk about what we're seeing here in Texas and what the needs are of our homeless students. We advocate for the families and the students, and then we have been administering a 3-year competitive grant, which in Texas is called the TechShep grant, and those are the McKinney-Vento funds I mentioned earlier, that we have 135 school districts that receive those funds. And if you need to know whether it's a school district in your area, you can find that information on our website. Basically, there are TechShep grantee recipients. It's up in the upper right-hand corner. You click on that, and it'll tell you every school district or education service center that receives the grant through our office. It won't tell you what's in the grant or what their budgets are and what they're addressing with their grant. You may have to contact those LEAs or ESCs individually to find that out. And this is our web resource. We have a lot of information on our website. a lot of one-page informational pieces. We've taken the law and we've broken it down by topic. So if you want to know about enrollment, if you want to know about identification or unaccompanied youth, how McKinney-Vento works or doesn't with foster students, all of those kinds of things are listed by topic. And of course, we have borrowed liberally from Schoolhouse Connection and the National Center for Homeless Education with documents that they have put out. And many of those are on our website, or they are linked to our website as well. And below that is our hotline. Again, it's an 800 line for anyone to use who has a question about McKinney-Vento or Texas state laws or supports or provisions for homeless students. Next slide. And this is us. So for contacting us, that's me up at the top there, and my email address, my direct line phone number, and then each of the staff here at the Texas Homeless Education Office. You can contact anybody individually by phone, through their email. Sometimes email is a little better way to do it because then you have a written answer or written reply that in case you need to kind of show that response to somebody, you have it. So I always encourage people, and sometimes even when I've spoken to them on the phone, I'll send them a synopsis of our conversation in writing just so that we're all on the same page and we know how to proceed with the issues. And that may be the last slide. Next slide. Oh, sorry, this is a very important slide. So Texas Education Agency, Kelly Kravitz is the state coordinator at the Texas Education Agency. And as I said, we work with TEA to carry out a lot of the functions of the state coordinator's office. But Kelly is a wealth of knowledge and a really wonderful advocate for students and families. And I certainly would encourage anybody who wanted to contact her around any of these issues to feel free to do so. Next slide. And that's it.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Astritha Vinakota. I'm another intern at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. So before we end, we just want to do 2 quick end polling questions just to gauge the effectiveness of today's webinar. So it's launched now. So on your screen, you should see the question. Basically, from this webinar, do you have a better understanding of the legal needs of displaced students? On the scale of yes a lot, yes a little, or no not really. So we'll leave that up for another 15 seconds. Again, this will just help us see the effect that and the helpfulness that this webinar has had for you guys. So like 5 more seconds. All right, we're gonna close it now. And from this, you can see that a lot of you thought it was helpful. So that's great. And that you have a better understanding of the legal needs of the students, which is great. So we're gonna have one more end polling question. And so you should see the questions launched now. You should see the question, will you use the information you learned today in your work or advocacy going forward? Simple yes or no are not applicable answers. Again, this will just help us see, has this webinar been effective and been helpful for you guys? So 5 seconds, we'll close that. See the last people to vote in. All right, we'll end that now. All right. So 91% of you will say you will, and 9% say non-applicable. So thank you guys so much for answering those questions.
All right, so we're nearing the end of the webinar. And again, this is Michael Santos from the Law Center. Thank you all for participating. We have a list of resources for you guys. And again, this will all be made available. These are some of these resources we happen to cover today. Some are not. I do want to focus on the ones that we haven't, in addition to what my colleagues and other speakers have talked about. So the resource available from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law in partnership with the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. You can see that link over there in the slide. There's also the Harvey Crisis Response Guide by Baker Botts. The American Bar Association is also helping mobilize the legal community and legal advocates in Texas, working with Texas Bar Association. And then if for those of you who are interested in doing more pro bono work or getting involved with pro bono work, the Association of Pro Bono Counsel has a Harvey network, so please feel free to contact Brenna Devaney at Skadden Arps for more information. And then I also added the Baker McKenzie's Texas Homeless Youth Handbook that Gabriela covered in the earlier slides. And again, just to reiterate, we have the Harvey Know Your Rights one-pager and the Homeless Education Advocacy Manual, Disaster Edition. I encourage for those of you to also for the attorneys and on the line, if you're interested in doing more work around this access to education issues, feel free to join the Lawyers Education Access Resource Network, also known as Project Learn. That contact person is me, so just feel free to get in touch with me after the webinar. And then again, just to reiterate the 5 key policies for schools that the Schoolhouse Connection put out on supporting children and youth displaced by disasters. And then finally, this has the contact information for all the speakers and all the organizations that were involved today. I do want to thank Patricia Julianelle from Schoolhouse Connection, Gabriela McDonald standing in for Deborah Fowler at Texas Appleseed, Christina Gendron from Texas Network of Youth Services, and last but not the least, Jean Stamp from Texas Homeless Education Office for taking the time today to talk about addressing the legal needs of displaced students. So we have a few more minutes, and I'm going to look over and see if there are other questions that were unanswered. There was one question, and I think this might be relevant for Jean Stamp. There was a question about students who are not homeless, but whose school districts are indefinitely closed, which is something that one of the slides was addressed. The question is, do they have any right to transportation to other school districts? Jean, is that something that you can answer?
Well, I can't give you specifics about that. Those students do have a right to enroll in another school district. And if they cannot get there, transportation should be provided. Again, this is something that's going to come out, and I do mean like daily. I expected perhaps to get it out today, but I haven't seen it come through yet, that the Texas Education Agency is going to be addressing how to handle the expense of the transportation for students whose districts are closed. And they must enroll in a neighboring district, but do not have transportation to get there on their own. So I know that's going to be addressed. I just can't tell you the specifics of what it's going to say.
Great, thank you. And then another question came in. So there was an attorney who was wondering how to obtain access to students who need assistance. So there are several ways that you can go about this. Definitely get in touch with the American Bar Association, with the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, with Association of Pro Bono Counsel, ABCO, and contact your local legal aid provider. They may also have access to students who may need legal assistance. So that's the best way to get involved. And again, if you need help with this endeavor, please contact me offline. I'm happy to provide you additional resources. But those contacts should be included in the last slide before our contact information. All right, so we are right on time, and I don't believe there are any outstanding questions. So we're going to go ahead and end this webinar. I just want to say thank you again, and we're looking to provide more webinars in the future about disaster relief and addressing the legal needs of students affected by disaster. We're just waiting to assess the specific needs in Florida and in other states, but please stay in tune. Please stay tuned. Thank you.